Grant Foster saw his wife before she saw him. She was sitting by the window at Café Lumiere, her fingers wrapped around a glass of white wine, laughing at something the man across from her had just said. It was a Tuesday at 2 p.m. The hour she was supposed to be in a faculty meeting at the university. The man leaned forward and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and Evelyn didn't flinch. She leaned in. Grant stood on the sidewalk, his reflection ghosting over the cafe glass, and felt something he didn't expect. Not rage, not heartbreak, but recognition, like he was watching the ending of a story he should have read more carefully. He straightened his coat, pushed open the door, and walked quietly to their table. Then he spoke. But what he said and why is not what you think. If you've ever stayed in a room where love had already left, this story will find you. Stay with me. Sir Grant Foster saw his wife before she saw him. It was 2:15 on a Tuesday in late October, and the wind off Lake Michigan was carrying the first real cold of autumn through the streets of downtown Chicago. Grant had left the foundation early, a rare thing almost unheard of, because his afternoon meeting had been canceled and, for once, he had no excuse to stay. He'd been walking south on Michigan Avenue with no particular destination when he passed Café Lumiere, a narrow French bistro wedged between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that put fresh flowers in the window boxes and charged $14 for a croque-monsieur. He almost didn't look inside. He almost kept walking. But something, maybe the peripheral blur of a familiar gesture, the tilt of a head he'd watched across 1,000 dinner tables, made him stop, made him turn, made him stand on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets and look through the glass. Evelyn was sitting by the window, her dark hair loose around her shoulders the way she only wore it on weekends. She was wearing the green blouse he liked, the one she said was too nice for faculty meetings. There was a glass of white wine in front of her, half empty, and she was laughing. Not the polite laugh she gave at foundation galas when someone told a mediocre joke. Not the tired laugh she managed on Sunday mornings when Lily said something cute. This was the laugh Grant hadn't heard in 2 years. Full-bodied, unguarded. The kind that crinkled the skin around her eyes and made her press her fingers to her collarbone. The man across from her leaned forward and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Grant watched Evelyn close her eyes at the touch. Just for a second. A flutter. Like a woman standing in sudden sunlight. He didn't recognize the man. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark suit, no tie, the casual confidence of someone who didn't need to try. His hand lingered near her face for a moment too long, and Evelyn didn't pull away. She leaned in, said something Grant couldn't hear through the glass. The man smiled. Their fingers found each other across the small table, intertwining with the ease of practice. Grant's reflection stared back at him from the cafe window, superimposed over his wife and her lover like a ghost haunting a scene he wasn't meant to see. He looked pale, thin, older than 38. The man in the glass was wearing a gray overcoat and a navy scarf Evelyn had given him last Christmas, and he was standing perfectly still on a busy sidewalk while the city moved around him like water around a stone. He waited for rage. It didn't come. He waited for the ground to open beneath him, for the cinematic collapse, the buckling knees, the white-hot flash of betrayal he'd seen in movies and always assumed was real. Nothing. Just a strange, terrible clarity, as though a lens had been adjusted and everything he'd been squinting at for years had suddenly snapped into focus. He thought about walking away. He thought about going back to the foundation, sitting at his desk, and pretending this Tuesday was like every other Tuesday. He thought about calling Brian. He thought about picking up Lily early from Pinehurst Day School and taking her for ice cream and never speaking of this afternoon again. Instead, Grant straightened his coat. He pushed open the door of Café Lumiere. A small bell chimed above his head, a sound so gentle it felt like mockery. The cafe smelled like roasted coffee and butter pastry. A Chet Baker song was playing from a speaker near the register, the trumpet low and mournful, as though the room had known he was coming and chosen the appropriate score. He walked toward the table by the window. His shoes were quiet on the tile floor. Evelyn's back was half turned to him, her attention fixed on the man whose name Grant did not yet know. He was close enough now to hear her voice, the particular softness she used when she was being sincere, and the sound of it, that tender register she hadn't used with him in so long, was the first thing that actually hurt. He stopped at the edge of the table. The man noticed him first. A flicker of confusion, then a polite, questioning smile, the expression of someone who assumes they're about to be asked for directions. Then Evelyn turned. The color left her face in stages. First the cheeks, then the lips, then something behind the eyes, a light going out or perhaps a door slamming shut. Her hand withdrew from the man's so fast it knocked her wine glass. It didn't fall, but it wobbled, and a thin line of Sancerre slid down the stem and pooled on the white tablecloth like a small wound. Grant looked at his wife. He looked at the man. He looked at the wine stain spreading slowly across the linen. Then he spoke. But what he said, the exact words, the tone, the thing that changed everything, you won't hear yet. Because to understand what Grant Foster said to his wife and her lover at a corner table in Café Lumiere on a Tuesday afternoon in October, you first have to understand everything that led them there. And that story begins 3 years before, on a night when Grant still believed silence was the same thing as peace. 3 years before the café, Grant Foster still held his wife's hand in public. It was a fact so small it barely registered as remarkable, but Evelyn noticed, had always noticed. The way his fingers would find hers when they crossed a street, when they stood in line at the grocery store, when they walked through Crescent Park on Sunday mornings with Lily balanced on Grant's shoulders, her tiny fists clutching his hair like reins. It was automatic, unconscious, the gesture of a man who had not yet learned to let go. They had married in that same park, 7 years ago, beneath a canopy of white birch trees in early June. Evelyn wore a simple dress. Ivory, not white, because she said white felt like a promise too clean for real people. And Grant wore a suit he'd bought the day before because he'd been so consumed with foundation work that he'd forgotten to get it tailored. It was slightly too big in the shoulders, and in every wedding photo he looked like a boy playing dress-up, grinning with a joy so naked it made Evelyn's chest ache every time she saw it. The early years were good. Not perfect, Evelyn would never have trusted perfection, but good in the way that matters. Morning coffee made without asking, arguments that ended with apologies before midnight, the shared mythology of a young marriage. They had their rituals. Thursday dinners at 6:15, always at the same Italian place on Clark Street, where the owner knew their names and brought Lily crayons. Saturday mornings in bed, reading, Grant with his policy briefs, Evelyn with whatever novel she was teaching that semester. Their legs tangled together, Lily wedged between them watching cartoons on an iPad with the volume low. Grant was devoted to the foundation. It was his father's creation. Walter Foster had started it in the 1990s with a mission to fund after-school programs on the South Side. And when Walter died of a heart attack 6 years ago, Grant inherited the directorship like a second name. He was good at it, disciplined, the kind of leader who answered every email, remembered every donor's birthday, and stayed 2 hours past everyone else because he believed the work demanded it. Evelyn understood. She'd married a man with a cause, and she respected the weight of it. She taught Romantic-era literature at a private university, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and spent her evenings grading papers at the kitchen table with a glass of red wine and a playlist of Debussy. She loved her work the way Grant loved his. Not as a job, but as a second self. The problem, if you could even call it a problem in those early years, was that two people deeply committed to their separate callings must make a deliberate effort to remain committed to each other. And for a while they did. Grant would leave the office by 6. Evelyn would close her laptop by 9. They'd meet in the living room, in the kitchen, in the narrow hallway of their Lakeview apartment, and they'd talk. Really talk. About Lily's emerging personality. She was stubborn, imaginative, a tiny philosopher who once asked Evelyn why the moon didn't fall. About their fears. About the future. But the adjustment was so gradual that neither of them felt it happen. It started, as these things always start, with small subtractions. Grant began staying at the office until 7. Then 7:30. Then 8. He'd text Evelyn, running late. Don't wait up. And she'd reply with a thumbs-up emoji, which he accepted as understanding and she intended as surrender. The Thursday dinners became bi-weekly, then monthly, then occasional. Lily started first grade at Pinehurst Day School, and suddenly there were permission slips and parent-teacher conferences and science fair volcanoes, and the logistics of raising a child consumed the space where intimacy used to live. One evening in March, 3 years before the cafe, almost to the week, Evelyn stood in the doorway of their bedroom, wearing a dress she'd bought for the occasion, and reminded Grant that she was giving a reading at the university that night. A public lecture on Byron's letters. She'd mentioned it twice before. She'd emailed him the flyer. Grant was on his laptop. He looked up, registered the dress, registered the expectation in her face and said, "Tonight, I've got the Henderson donor call at 7. I thought that was next Thursday." It wasn't next Thursday, she told him. He'd written it down somewhere and then written over it with something he considered more urgent. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a long moment. She was holding her car keys. Her lipstick was the color of dark cherries, and Grant would later remember that detail with the specificity of guilt. The deep red of her mouth, the way she pressed her lips together before she spoke. "It's fine," she said. "I'll tell you how it goes." She didn't tell him how it went. He didn't ask. And that night, after the reading, where she'd spoken to a room of 200 people about the letters Byron wrote to his half-sister, about the unbearable intimacy of writing to someone you couldn't have, Evelyn came home, hung her dress in the closet, and lay down beside her husband in the dark. He was already asleep. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she rolled onto her side, facing the wall, and something between them shifted. A tectonic plate moving half an inch, silent and irreversible. In the morning, Grant made coffee for both of them, kissed Lily on the forehead, and left for work at 6:45 a.m. He did not notice anything had changed. The afternoon Grant left Café Lumiere. He drove for 2 hours without destination. He took Lakeshore Drive north, then south, then north again. The gray expanse of Lake Michigan on his right, indifferent and enormous, the skyline behind him growing and shrinking in his rearview mirror like something breathing. The heater was on, but he was cold. His hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles bloodless, and he realized at some point near Montrose Harbor that he was holding his breath. Had been holding it, perhaps, since the moment Evelyn turned and the color drained from her face like water from a cracked glass. He pulled over at Crescent Park. Their park. The birch trees were bare now, stripped down to bone-white limbs, and the bench where they'd taken wedding photos was occupied by an old man feeding pigeons from a paper bag. Grant sat in his car with the engine running and the radio off and stared at the bench through the windshield. He tried to feel something specific. Anger would have been useful, the clean, righteous kind that powered confrontations and justified slamming doors. But anger requires certainty, and Grant didn't have certainty. He had an image. Evelyn's fingers intertwined with a stranger's. Her eyes closing at his touch. The laugh. That specific, surrendered laugh. These images played on a loop behind his eyes, and each repetition wore away a layer of something. Not pain exactly, but structure. The architecture of assumption. The things he'd taken for granted were dissolving, and the space they left behind was cavernous. He pulled out his phone. Brian Cooper's name sat at the top of his recent calls. Brian, his college roommate, now a corporate attorney downtown, the kind of friend who spoke in absolutes and drank bourbon with conviction. Brian would know what to do. Brian would say something definitive. Grant pressed the call button. It rang 3 times. "Foster. What's up? You never call before 5. Grant opened his mouth. The words were right there. "I saw Evelyn with someone, Brian. At a cafe. His hand was in her hair, and she was laughing, and I stood on the sidewalk like a stranger watching someone else's life. But what came out was nothing. Just wanted to see if you were free for a drink later this week. Thursday works. Sapphire Lounge? Sure. Thursday." He hung up. He sat in the car for another 20 minutes, turning his wedding ring around his finger. The gold was warm from his skin. He'd never taken it off, not once in 7 years. Not to sleep, not to shower, not to wash dishes. It had become so much a part of his hand that he sometimes forgot it was there, which, he thought now, was perhaps the most honest metaphor for his entire marriage. At 4:30, he drove to Pinehurst Day School. Lily was waiting on the front steps with her backpack. Purple. decorated with iron-on patches of stars and planets that Evelyn had helped her apply last summer. She ran to the car and climbed into the back seat. "Daddy, you never pick me up on Tuesdays." "Surprise," Grant said. His voice sounded strange to him. Then, a voice holding something back. "Can we get hot chocolate?" "Absolutely." They went to the cafe on Belmont. Not Lumiere, never Lumiere again, and Lily talked about her day. The guinea pig in Miss Hartman's class had escaped and run under the bookshelf, and Lily had been the one to coax it out with a piece of carrot. She told the story with wide eyes and elaborate hand gestures, and Grant listened with the desperate attention of a man who has just discovered that this small voice, this sticky hot chocolate mustache, this trusting weight leaning against his arm in a vinyl booth, might be the only uncomplicated love he has left. They got home at 6. The apartment was dark. Evelyn wasn't back yet. Grant made Lily dinner, mac and cheese, the box kind she preferred over Evelyn's homemade version, a preference that had always been a small joke between them and now felt like a hairline fracture. He supervised her bath. He read her 2 chapters of Charlotte's Web, the part where Wilbur discovers Charlotte's egg sac, and when she fell asleep with one arm around her stuffed rabbit, he stood in her doorway and watched her breathe. His daughter's room smelled like watercolor paint and strawberry shampoo. The nightlight cast a pale blue glow across the ceiling, turning it into something that looked like water, like sky, like the inside of a world where no one had broken anything yet. He closed her door quietly and walked into the kitchen. Evelyn's phone was on the counter. She must have left it when she'd come home to change before wherever she'd gone after the cafe. The screen was face up, and as Grant reached for a glass from the cabinet, it lit up with a notification. He didn't see the name. He didn't read the preview, but he saw enough to know it was a message, and that it was there, waiting like an unlocked door to a room full of evidence. He stood over the phone for a long time. His hand moved toward it, then stopped, then moved again. He picked up the glass instead, filled it with water from the tap, drank it standing at the sink, looking out the kitchen window at the apartment building across the alley, where someone else's lights were on and someone else's life was continuing without interruption. He left Evelyn's phone on the counter, untouched. He wasn't ready to know the details. The shape of it was enough. The shape of her leaning in, the shape of her laughter, the shape of a hand that wasn't his touching the face he'd kissed 10,000 times. Grant sat down at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for his wife to come home. 18 months before the cafe, on a warm Friday evening in April, Grant Foster introduced his wife to Derek Stone. It happened at the Foundation's annual spring gala, a black tie fundraiser held on the rooftop of the Sterling Building, where 300 donors mingled among catered hors d'oeuvres and string quartet music and the quiet, competitive philanthropy of Chicago's upper middle class. Grant had been working the room for 2 hours, shaking hands, remembering names, performing the particular brand of earnest gratitude that kept the checks coming. Evelyn stood beside him for the first hour, smiling in a black dress she'd bought that afternoon because nothing in her closet felt right anymore. She'd told Grant this, that she felt like she had nothing to wear, that she wasn't sure about the neckline, that she needed his opinion, and he'd been on a call with the Henderson Foundation. He'd given her a thumbs up without looking. She'd bought the dress alone. Derek Stone was an architectural consultant who'd been brought in to assess the Foundation's plan to renovate a community center on the South Side. He was 43, divorced 2 years, the kind of man who wore his solitude well. Not bitter, not hungry, just settled into a quiet self-sufficiency that some women found irresistible. He had a firm handshake and an easy laugh and a habit of listening with his entire body, turning toward the speaker as though nothing else in the room existed. Grant introduced them because it was polite. "Derek, this is my wife, Evelyn. She teaches literature. Evelyn, Derek's the architect working on the Garfield Park project." They shook hands. Evelyn said something about the renovation plans she'd seen on Grant's desk. Derek asked what she taught. She said Byron and Shelley, and he said his ex-wife had been an English major, and they laughed about the particular madness of loving dead poets, and Grant, already being pulled away by a donor with a question about tax deductions, touched Evelyn's shoulder and said, "I'll be right back." He was not right back. He was gone for 45 minutes, and when he returned, Evelyn and Derek were still talking, leaning against the rooftop railing with the city spread out behind them like a promise. Grant felt nothing. No alarme, no gealou-se, no premonition. He saw his wife talking to a colleague and thought, good. She's having a nice time. She doesn't always enjoy these events. He didn't notice the way Evelyn's posture had changed, how she was standing taller, how her gestures had become more animated, how she was speaking with the particular intensity she reserved for subjects she cared about. He didn't notice because he'd stopped cataloging the details of his wife. He knew her in the way you know your own house, so thoroughly that you stop seeing the cracks in the plaster, the paint that's begun to peel, the window that doesn't close all the way and lets the cold in at night. This was the year things accelerated. Grant took on 3 new partnerships for the foundation, each requiring evening meetings, weekend calls, out-of-town visits to satellite programs. He was building something, expanding his father's legacy into something larger, something Walter Foster would have been proud of, and the building consumed him with the totality of a second marriage. He came home after Lily's bedtime 4 nights out of 5. He stopped cooking, stopped reading, stopped suggesting weekend trips to the lake. He was present in the way a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, serving a function, but lacking the warmth of a living thing. Evelyn adapted. She built a life around his absence. Grading papers at the kitchen table, taking Lily to gymnastics, having dinner with her sister Rachel on Wednesday nights. She stopped texting Grant during the day because his replies had become so sparse and delayed that each unanswered message felt like a small rejection. She stopped waiting up for him, stopped leaving a plate in the microwave, stopped asking how the Henderson meeting went or whether the Garfield Park renovation was on schedule. She stopped, and he didn't notice that she'd stopped, and that was the thing that broke her. Not his absence, but his obliviousness to what his absence was doing. Derek Stone called her in June, 3 months after the gala. He had a question about a poem. He was giving a presentation to a client who wanted literary quotes incorporated into the design of a library, and could she recommend something? It was a thin pretext, and they both knew it, but it was also innocent. A phone call about Byron. 20 minutes. She hung up feeling lighter. He called again in July. Then August. The conversations grew longer, more personal. He told her about his divorce, how it had been slow, civilized, and devastating in its civility. She told him about the silence in her apartment, the particular quality of loneliness that comes from sharing a bed with someone who has forgotten you're there. They began meeting for coffee. Tuesday afternoons, when Evelyn's teaching schedule was light and Grant was reliably buried in his office. Always public, always daytime, always with the unspoken agreement that this was friendship, just friendship, because acknowledging it as anything else would require a decision neither of them was ready to make. The coffees became lunches. The lunches became longer. And one afternoon in September, a year before the cafe, Derek reached across the table and touched her hand, and Evelyn didn't pull away. She went home that night and looked at Grant across the dinner table and thought, he won't ask me how my day was. He never asks anymore. Grant ate his pasta, checked his phone, told Lily to finish her broccoli, kissed Evelyn on the temple before disappearing into his home office. He did not ask. On the night after the cafe, Evelyn came home at 9:47 p.m. Grant knew the exact time because he'd been sitting in the living room for 3 hours, and at some point during the second hour, time had become the only thing he could track with certainty. The apartment was dark except for the hallway light, a single warm bulb that cast a thin stripe across the hardwood floor and stopped just short of the armchair where he sat. He hadn't turned on the television. He hadn't poured a drink. He sat in the quiet the way a patient sits in a waiting room, unsure of the diagnosis but certain it will change everything. He heard her key in the lock, the familiar sequence. Key turning, door opening, the soft exhale she always made when she stepped inside, as though crossing the threshold required a particular effort. Then the rustle of her coat being hung, the click of her shoes on the entryway tile, the pause. She would always pause to check her reflection in the hallway mirror, a habit so ingrained Grant could time it. 3 seconds exactly, before she moved deeper into the apartment. She walked into the living room and stopped. Grant! Her voice carried the slight uptick of surprise. You're up. I thought you'd be. I left the office early today, he said. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the hall light, her features in shadow. He couldn't read her expression, but he could read her posture, the way her shoulders pulled back slightly, the way her hand found the doorframe. She was recalibrating, assembling the right version of herself for this unexpected encounter. The Henderson meeting got cancelled, he added, because he could feel the silence filling with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Oh, she moved into the room, sat on the arm of the sofa. Not the cushion, the arm, as though she might need to leave quickly. How was your day? The question nearly broke him. She hadn't asked him that in months, and the fact that she was asking now, tonight of all nights, felt less like genuine interest and more like the nervous patter of someone filling dead air. Fine, he said. Quiet. Lily. Asleep. We got hot chocolate after school. That's nice. A small smile. She loves when you pick her up. The sentence landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. She loves when you pick her up. The implication that his picking up Lily was an event rather than a routine sat in the air, and Grant thought about all the Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays he'd left the school run to Evelyn. All the afternoons Lily had waited on those front steps watching for a car that was always the same one, driven by the same parent because the other parent was reliably somewhere else. How was your faculty meeting? He asked. He watched her face. This was the moment, the crossroads where truth and fiction diverged, and the path she chose would tell him everything he needed to know. Not about the affair, but about the distance between who she was and who she'd become. Evelyn didn't hesitate. Long, she said. Dr. Pearson went on for 40 minutes about the curriculum review. I thought I'd lose my mind. She laughed, a short practice sound. The laugh of a woman who had rehearsed this answer in the car. Grant nodded. He absorbed the lie the way the body absorbs a slow poison, not with a violent reaction, but with a quiet, systemic adjustment. Something inside him rearranged itself to accommodate this new reality. His wife could look at him across a dark room and invent an afternoon that never happened, and she could do it without trembling. But here was the thing that disturbed Grant more than the lie itself. As he studied Evelyn perched on the arm of the sofa, her hair slightly windswept, her cheeks still carrying a trace of color, her eyes brighter than he'd seen them in months, he recognized something. She looked alive. Not the performative brightness of social occasions or the wired alertness of too much coffee, but something deeper, a vitality, presence. She looked, he thought, the way she used to look, and the thought that followed was the one he would carry for weeks, turning it over in the dark like a stone in his pocket. She is more herself with him than she is with me. Are you okay? Evelyn asked. She was looking at him now with something approaching attention, and he wondered whether it was genuine concern or merely the awareness that his silence had become unusual. Just tired, he said. You work too much. She said it softly, not an accusation, a eulogy. She stood, crossed the room and touched his shoulder briefly, the way you touch a piece of furniture to confirm it's still there, before walking to the bedroom. He heard the water run, the muffled sounds of her nightly routine, and then silence. Grant sat in the dark living room. He looked down at his hands. The wedding ring caught the thin stripe of hallway light and held it. A small gold circle containing an even smaller reflection of a room where two people had just failed, again, to reach each other. He did not follow her to bed. Not because he was angry, but because he understood, with a clarity that felt like suffocation, that the bed they shared had become the loneliest place in the apartment. Grant found the journal on a Thursday, 1 week after the cafe. 1 week of performing the ordinary, breakfast, commute, meetings, dinner, the careful choreography of a man pretending his life has not been split open. He'd become an expert at it, this performance, and the ease with which he slipped into it frightened him. He smiled at Evelyn over morning coffee. He helped Lily with her spelling words. He attended a board meeting at the foundation where he spoke for 20 minutes about community impact metrics, and not a single person in the room suspected that the man in the charcoal suit was holding together by nothing more than habit and the stubborn refusal to shatter in public. But the cracks were there. He'd stopped sleeping through the night, waking at 3 a.m., to the sound of his own pulse, the images cycling back, wine glass, laughter, fingers intertwining. He'd started driving past Café Lumiere on his way to work, not to spy, but because the masochistic part of his brain needed to confirm that it was real, that the place existed in daylight and not just in the nightmare reel that played behind his eyes. On Thursday, Evelyn left for the university at 8:15. Lily was already at school. Grant stood in the silent apartment and felt the emptiness like a physical weight. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of reason to move through the rooms. He had no meetings until 11. 2 hours alone in the space where his marriage lived. He walked into Evelyn's home office. He wasn't looking for evidence. He'd made his decision at the kitchen counter a week ago. The phone, face up, notification glowing, untouched. He'd chosen not to look. But this was different. He'd come into the office to find Lily's permission slip for a school field trip, which Evelyn had said was on her desk. The permission slip was there under a stack of unmarked essays. He signed it. He was turning to leave when he saw the notebook. It was leather-bound, dark green, the size of a paperback novel. It sat on the second shelf of the bookcase, between a collected Keats and a dog-eared copy of Persuasion. He'd seen it before, or rather, he'd seen it without seeing it, the way you see everything in a room you've entered 1,000 times. But today, something about it caught his attention. The spine was creased with use. The edges were soft, handled. This was not a decorative object. This was something that had been opened and closed hundreds of times. Something that had been held. Grant pulled it from the shelf. The first entry was dated 2 years ago. January. Evelyn's handwriting. Small, slanted. The looping cursive of a woman who'd grown up writing letters by hand. January 14th. He came home at 9:30 tonight. I'd made the risotto he likes, the one with the mushrooms and thyme. It was cold by the time he sat down. He said it was good. He didn't look at me when he said it. I wonder sometimes if he knows I'm here, or if I've become part of the furniture. The couch. The lamp. The wife. Grant lowered himself into the desk chair. He read the next entry and the next and the next. He read for an hour. The permission slip sat signed and forgotten on the desk. The clock on the wall ticked through the silence, and the apartment held still around him, as though the walls themselves were listening. The journal was not a confession of an affair. It was something worse. It was a record of disappearance. Evelyn's slow, meticulous documentation of becoming invisible in her own marriage. March 8th. I asked him to come to Lily's art show at school. He said he'd try. He didn't come. Lily looked for him in the audience. She didn't say anything, but she held my hand tighter during the drive home. May 22nd, he forgot our anniversary. I didn't remind him. I wanted to see how long it would take him to remember. It's been 4 days. July 3rd. I sat on the back porch tonight and listened to the neighborhood fireworks. Grant was in his office with the door closed. Lily was asleep. I drank a glass of wine and thought about calling someone. Anyone. Just to hear a voice that was speaking to me on purpose. September 15th. He sits across from me, but I can't reach him. He is right there and I can't reach him. November 2nd. I don't think he sees me anymore. I have become weather to him. Something that happens around him. Something he adjusts to without noticing. There was no mention of Derek Stone. Not in January, not in March, not in July. The name appeared for the first time in October, a year into the journal, a year after the gala, and even then, it was oblique. October 10th, had coffee with D. Again today. He asked me about the poem I'm teaching, the Byron letter to Augusta. He listened like it mattered. I forgot what that feels like. Someone listening like it matters. Grant closed the journal. He held it in his lap with both hands, the way you hold something fragile or dangerous, and stared at the wall of Evelyn's office. The wall was covered with framed prints of romantic poets and postcards from literary conferences and a photograph of the three of them. Grant, Evelyn, Lily. Taken at Crescent Park on Lily's 4th birthday, everyone squinting into the sun, everyone smiling. The man in the photograph had his arm around his wife. He looked happy. He looked present. Grant studied his own face in the photo and tried to remember. When had he left? Not the apartment, not the marriage. When had he left her? When had he stopped being the man with his arm around her shoulders and started being the man who came home at 9:30 and said the risotto was good without looking up? He didn't have an answer. The departure had been so gradual it had no date, No single moment he could point to and say, that's where I went. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small absences, 1,000 evenings when he'd chosen the office over the living room, the email over the conversation, the work over the woman. The betrayal, Grant realized, had not started at Café Lumiere. It had started in this apartment, at this desk, in the silence he'd mistaken for peace. He placed the journal back on the shelf, between Keats and Austen, exactly where he'd found it. He picked up the permission slip. He left the office and closed the door. And for the first time since Tuesday, Grant Foster felt something that wasn't numbness or shock or the dull ache of discovery. He felt ashamed. Brian Cooper poured 2 fingers of Woodford Reserve into a crystal glass, slid it across the bar at the Sapphire Lounge, and said, "Tell me." It was Thursday evening, the drink date Grant had arranged from the parking lot of Crescent Park 9 days ago, and the lounge was half empty. Leather booths, low lighting, the kind of place where men in expensive coats discuss things they couldn't say at home. Grant picked up the glass. He didn't drink. He held it and watched the amber liquid tilt, catching the light of the Edison bulbs overhead. "Evelyn is having an affair," he said. The words left his mouth and entered the world with less force than he'd expected. He'd been carrying them for 9 days, and he'd imagined that saying them aloud would feel like detonation. A bomb going off in the quiet lounge, glass shattering, the bartender looking up, but it was quiet. Brian's hand stopped midway to his own glass. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed with the precision of a man whose profession was building cases. "Who?" Brian asked. "His name is Derek Stone, architect. I introduced them at the Foundation Gala last spring." "You introduced?" Brian shook his head. "How long?" "I don't know exactly. Months." "How'd you find out?" "I saw them. Cafe on Michigan Avenue. She told me she was at a faculty meeting." Brian leaned forward. His voice dropped, not to a whisper but to the register he used in conference rooms when the stakes were high. "Grant, listen to me. You need to document everything. Texts, emails, credit card statements. I can refer you to Tim Nelson. He's the best family attorney in the city. Handled the Whitmore divorce last year. You remember that?" She walked away with the house, both cars, and full custody. "Brian, no, listen. I know you. You're sitting there thinking about what you did wrong, how you could have been a better husband, some noble bullshit about understanding her perspective. But she lied to your face. She's sleeping with another man while you're picking up your daughter from school and making her mac and cheese. That's not a gray area, Grant. That's betrayal." Grant took his first sip. The bourbon burned in a clean line from throat to chest, and for a moment, just a moment, the heat replaced the cold numbness that had taken up residence behind his ribs. "It's not that simple," Grant said. "It is exactly that simple." But it wasn't. And Grant didn't know how to explain why. Didn't know how to tell Brian about the journal, about the entries that read like a slow-motion elegy for a marriage that had died of neglect. He didn't know how to say, "I read her grief, Brian. 2 years of it. And my name was in every entry, not as the villain but as the ghost. The man who was there but wasn't." So he said nothing. He drank his bourbon. Brian talked about strategy, about protecting assets, about Lily. Grant listened and nodded and felt the distance between Brian's certainty and his own confusion stretch wider with every word. Across town, at a wine bar in Lincoln Park, Rachel Green was having the opposite conversation. Rachel was 4 years older than Evelyn. A pediatrician, married, 2 kids, the kind of woman who organized her pantry by expiration date and ran half marathons on Saturday mornings. She was the responsible sister, the safe harbor, and she was, at this moment, terrified. "How long?" Rachel asked, her wine untouched. 5 months, Evelyn said. She was looking at the table. "Since May." "Ave." "I know. Grant he's a good man. I know he's a good man." Evelyn's voice cracked on the word good, as though the word itself was the problem. "He's a good man who doesn't see me. He's a good man who forgot our anniversary and missed Lily's art show and hasn't asked me a real question in 2 years. He's good, Rachel. He's so good that he doesn't even know he's gone. Rachel reached across the table and took her sister's hand. Have you told Derek it's over? Not yet. You need to. I know. And Grant. Does he? No. Evelyn shook her head. He doesn't know. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. The wine bar hummed around them. Couples at small tables, laughter, the clink of glasses. All around them, the performance of connection. I saw it, Ev, Rachel said quietly. I saw it happening. At Thanksgiving last year, the way he was on his phone the entire dinner, the way you kept looking at him like you were waiting for him to come back from wherever he goes. I should have said something. What would you have said? I don't know. Something. Anything. Evelyn pulled her hand away. She pressed her fingertips to her temples and closed her eyes. I didn't plan this. I need you to know that. I didn't go looking for someone. I was so lonely, Rachel. I was so lonely in my own house that I started talking to someone who listened, and then I couldn't stop, and then it was too late to pretend it was just talking. It's not too late to stop. Maybe. Evelyn opened her eyes. They were red but dry. She'd done her crying in private, in the car, in the shower, in the 10-minute gaps between classes where she locked her office door and pressed her back against the wall and let the guilt wash over her in waves. But even if I stop, even if Derek disappears tomorrow, the thing that sent me to him is still there. The emptiness. Still there. Rachel didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her wine and drank, and the two sisters sat in the noise of other people's happiness and said nothing for a very long time. Grant met Derek Stone on a Monday. He'd planned it for 3 days, a careful construction of pretexts and logistics that felt uncomfortably like the kind of scheming he'd always associated with other people's worst impulses. He'd emailed Derek through the Foundation's official account, requesting a follow-up consultation on the Garfield Park Community Center renovation. A routine meeting, billable hours, nothing unusual. Derek had replied within the hour, happy to discuss. Monday afternoon works for me. Your office or somewhere more relaxed. Grant chose the Sapphire Lounge. Not because it was comfortable, the memory of Brian's voice still echoed off the leather booths, but because he wanted neutral ground, the kind of place where two men could sit across from each other and pretend the conversation was about architecture while something else entirely unfolded beneath the surface. He arrived early, ordered a club soda, sat with his back to the wall and watched the door. Derek Stone walked in at 3:15, punctual, confident, wearing a dark wool coat over a gray sweater, no tie. He was taller than Grant had registered at the gala, with the kind of lean, angular face that looked good in photographs. He moved through the room with an ease Grant envied, the comfort of a man who had already survived his worst chapter and come out lighter on the other side. They shook hands. Derek sat down, ordered an espresso, and smiled. Good to see you again, Grant. It's been, over a year since the gala? About that. Evelyn mentioned you've been expanding the Foundation's programs. South Side, West Side, impressive scope. The mention of Evelyn's name landed in Grant's chest like a fist. She'd talked about him. To Derek. She'd sat across from this man, perhaps at this very hour on a different afternoon, and spoken about her husband's work with enough detail that Derek could reference it casually, as though he and Grant were old friends catching up. She's always been my biggest supporter, Grant said. He watched Derek's face for the micro-expression. The flinch, the flicker of guilt, the tell. Derek's expression didn't change. His smile remained easy, his eyes direct. Either he was an exceptional liar, or he genuinely didn't know that Grant knew. Grant decided it was the latter. Evelyn would not have told him. The affair depended on compartmentalization, the clean separation of the life she lived with Grant and the life she lived without him. They talked about the renovation for 20 minutes. Square footage, load-bearing walls, the cost of sustainable materials. Derek was knowledgeable, articulate, and, Grant had to admit, genuinely passionate about the project. He spoke about community spaces with the idealism of someone who believed that buildings could heal neighborhoods, and Grant recognized the tone. It was the same tone he used when he talked about the Foundation. The same devotion, the same fire. He'd expected a villain. He'd expected to sit across from Derek Stone and find the evidence of moral failure, the arrogance, the sleaze, the predatory edge that would make the narrative simple. Bad man seduces good wife. But Derek was none of those things. He was articulate, thoughtful, and carried the quiet gravity of a man who'd been through a divorce and emerged not bitter but open. Grant hated him for it, not because Derek was hateable but because he wasn't. The conversation drifted. Derek mentioned his divorce. Casually, the way people mention major life events once enough time has passed to sand down the edges. His ex-wife was a college professor, he said. English literature. The coincidence had made him and Evelyn laugh when they first met. We bonded over it, Derek said, and then stopped. A pause, the first crack in his composure. He picked up his espresso and drank, and Grant saw, in the brief moment when Derek's eyes shifted away, the shadow of something unguarded. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. Care. Derek cared about her. This was not a man who had seduced Grant's wife for sport or ego. This was a man who had found a woman in pain and recognized the ache because he carried his own, and they had reached toward each other in the way drowning people reach for anything solid. She talks about you a lot, Derek said. He said it simply, without apparent strategy, and Grant understood that this was the truth. Evelyn talked about him. To the man she was sleeping with, she talked about her husband. What does she say? Grant asked. His voice was steady. His hands, beneath the table, were not. Derek seemed to weigh the question. She says you're dedicated, that you're the most principled person she's ever known. He paused. She also says your marriage has been difficult, that you've both been struggling. There it was. Your marriage has been difficult. Evelyn's version, the edited narrative, the story she told herself and Derek to justify the afternoons and the coffees and the hand across the table. And the worst part, the part that made Grant grip the edge of the booth until his knuckles whitened, was that it wasn't a lie. The marriage had been difficult. They had been struggling. She hadn't invented a fiction to excuse herself. She'd simply described the truth and let Derek fill in the space she'd left empty. She told me it was already over, Derek said quietly. Between you two. She said it had been over for a while. Grant looked at Derek Stone across the dim table of the Sapphire Lounge and felt something collapse inside him. Not the floor, not the walls, but the last scaffolding of certainty. Because he couldn't say with honesty that Evelyn was wrong. He couldn't sit here and declare that their marriage was alive and thriving when he'd spent 2 years treating it like a building he owned but never visited. She told Derek it was over, and maybe, in every way that mattered, it had been. Thank you for the consultation, Grant said. He left a $100 bill on the table. Far too much for 2 drinks, and stood. Derek looked up at him with an expression Grant would remember for years. Not defiance, not apology, but a kind of sorrowful recognition. One man looking at another and understanding, without words, that they were both standing in the wreckage of the same woman's loneliness. Grant walked out into the cold Chicago afternoon and stood on the sidewalk. The wind was sharp. His eyes stung. He told himself it was the wind. The morning it happened, Grant was making pancakes. It was a Saturday, the kind of bright, cold November Saturday that turns Chicago into a postcard of sharp light and bare trees. Evelyn had left early for a yoga class, or that's what she'd said, and Grant had accepted it with the passive neutrality that had become his default operating mode. He stood at the stove in the kitchen, flipping silver dollar pancakes on a cast-iron skillet that had been a wedding gift from his mother, and Lily sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas, drawing circles on a sheet of construction paper with a red crayon. Daddy. Yeah, sweetheart. Why does Mommy cry in the car? Grant's hand stopped mid-flip. The pancake sat half-turned on the spatula, golden on one side, raw on the other. He didn't move for 3 seconds. A silence so complete that the sizzle of batter on iron sounded enormous. What do you mean, Lily? When she picks me up from school. Sometimes she's crying. She wipes her face really fast when I open the door, but I can see it. Her eyes are all red. Lily said this with the matter-of-fact clarity of a 6-year-old reporting on weather. No drama, no fear, just observation. The sky is blue. The grass is green. Mommy cries in the car. Grant turned back to the stove. He flipped the pancake. He pressed the spatula flat against it and listened to the hiss and thought about Evelyn sitting in the driver's seat of their Volvo in the Pinehurst Day School parking lot, wiping tears from her face before opening the door for their daughter. He thought about how many times this had happened. He thought about Lily watching, cataloging, carrying this small piece of adult wreckage in her 6-year-old mind alongside multiplication tables and the names of planets. "Sometimes grown-ups get sad, baby," he said. "It doesn't mean anything's wrong." The lie came so easily it sickened him. Lily accepted it. She went back to her circles. Grant served the pancakes with maple syrup and strawberries, and they ate together in the kitchen with morning light pouring through the window, and the scene was so perfectly domestic, so postcard, so sitcom, so this is what a family looks like, that Grant wanted to put his head down on the table and weep. He didn't. He ate his pancakes. He wiped syrup from Lily's chin. He loaded the dishwasher. And then he drove Lily to Crescent Park because she wanted to feed the ducks, and he needed to be somewhere that wasn't the apartment, somewhere that didn't smell like pancake batter and guilt and the slow decomposition of everything he'd built. The park was busy, joggers, dog walkers, a group of college students throwing a frisbee near the birch grove where Grant and Evelyn had exchanged vows. Lily ran ahead with a bag of stale bread, and Grant followed at a distance, watching her small body navigate the path with the fearless confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the ground can shift beneath you. She stopped at the pond's edge and began tearing bread into pieces, tossing them to the ducks with exaggerated throws that sent crumbs scattering. A mallard waddled up to her feet, and she laughed. That bright, uncomplicated sound that children make before the world teaches them to be careful with joy. Grant sat on the nearest bench. The wood was cold through his coat. He watched Lily and thought about the custody conversation he'd eventually have to have with Evelyn, with a lawyer, with a judge. He thought about Lily shuttling between 2 apartments, 2 bedrooms, 2 Christmases. He thought about the studies he'd read in his foundation work, the research on children of divorce, the statistics on behavioral outcomes, the clinical language that reduced a child's heartbreak to data points. His daughter was feeding ducks in the park. She was wearing a purple jacket with a broken zipper that Evelyn had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. She was humming a song from a movie Grant couldn't name. And she was, in this moment, whole, undamaged, unburdened, unaware that the 2 people who constituted her entire universe were standing on opposite sides of a fissure that was widening every day. Grant pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name Brian had given him. Tim Nelson, family attorney, Whitmore and Associates. He stared at the number. His thumb hovered over the call button. The wind picked up. Lily's bread bag blew out of her hand and tumbled across the grass, and she chased it, laughing, her hair streaming behind her. A duck followed, waddling in outraged pursuit, and Lily shrieked with delight. Grant pressed the button. The phone rang twice. A receptionist answered, calm, professional, the practiced tone of someone who fielded calls from people on the worst days of their lives. Whitmore and Associates. How may I direct your call? Tim Nelson, please. My name is Grant Foster. One moment, Mr. Foster. Hold music. Something classical, tasteful, utterly inappropriate. Grant watched Lily catch her bread bag and hold it triumphantly above her head, grinning at the duck as though she'd won a great victory. Mr. Foster? Tim Nelson. How can I help you? Grant closed his eyes. He pressed the phone hard against his ear. The wind stung his face, and somewhere across the park, his daughter was laughing, and the sound was the most beautiful and most painful thing he'd ever heard. I need to talk to you about a divorce, Grant said. He told her on a Wednesday, not a dramatic Wednesday. There was no storm, no particular occasion, no cinematic alignment of events that signaled this was the day. It was simply the day Grant's capacity for silence ran out. He'd been carrying it for nearly 3 weeks. 20 days of knowing, of performing, of lying beside Evelyn in the dark and listening to her breathe and wondering whether she was asleep or whether she, too, was staring at the ceiling, each of them marooned on their separate side of the mattress like survivors on different rafts. He waited until Lily was at Rachel's for a sleepover, a Wednesday arrangement Evelyn had started a few months ago, and which Grant now understood served a dual purpose. He waited until the apartment was empty of everyone except the 2 of them and the weight of everything unsaid. Evelyn was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine. Cabernet. She held the bottle with the practiced ease of someone who'd been self-medicating with careful glasses of red for longer than she'd admit. Grant stood in the doorway and watched her, and for a moment, a brief, treacherous moment, he saw the woman he'd married. The curve of her neck as she tilted the bottle. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear with her free hand. The particular way she stood with one foot slightly turned out. A dancer's habit from childhood lessons she'd abandoned at 14. He loved her. The realization arrived not as warmth but as grief. The way you discover you love a house most fiercely on the day you lose it. Evelyn. She turned. Something in his voice, the weight of it, the formality of her full name, made her set the bottle down. What is it? Grant walked to the kitchen table. He placed the green leather journal on the surface between them. Evelyn's face went through a series of changes so rapid they were almost imperceptible. Confusion, recognition, a flash of something white-hot that might have been fear or anger or both. Her hand moved involuntarily toward the journal, then stopped. She looked at Grant. You read it, she said. Not a question. I read it. All of it. Enough. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He gestured to the chair across from him. After a long moment, Evelyn sat. The journal lay between them like a territory neither dared to claim. I didn't read the parts about him, Grant said. His voice was steady. Not because he was calm, but because he'd practiced this conversation in his car, in his office, in the shower, rehearsing the words until they were worn smooth enough to say without breaking. I read the parts about me. Evelyn's eyes filled. She didn't blink. She let the tears gather and hold, a surface tension she maintained through sheer will. Grant. I saw you, he said, at Café Lumiere. 3 weeks ago, Tuesday. You were with him. You told me you were at a faculty meeting. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Grant had ever heard. Evelyn's mouth opened, closed. Her hands gripped the edge of the kitchen table, knuckles white against the wood, and the tears she'd been holding broke. Not dramatically, not with sobs, but in a slow, steady spill that ran down her cheeks and dripped onto her shirt. How long have you known? She whispered. 3 weeks. And you didn't say anything? For 3 weeks? I didn't know what to say. I still don't. She stared at him. Why now? Grant looked at the journal. He touched its cover with his index finger, tracing the edge of the leather. Because Lily asked me why you cry in the car. And I couldn't keep pretending everything is fine when our daughter is watching us fall apart and we're too busy protecting our own silence to notice. Evelyn pressed her hands to her face. She held them there for a long time, and Grant didn't reach for her. Not because he didn't want to, but because the distance between them, 3 feet of kitchen table, a green journal, 5 months of lies and 2 years of loneliness, was too vast to cross with a gesture. His name is Derek Stone, Evelyn said, her voice muffled behind her hands. But you know that already. I met him, last week, at the Sapphire Lounge. Her hands dropped. The shock on her face was genuine. You met him? I needed to see who he was. What kind of man? Grant stopped. He'd promised himself he wouldn't let this become about Derek. Derek was a symptom, not the disease. That's not what matters. Then what matters? Grant pushed the journal toward her. This matters. September 15th. He sits across from me, but I can't reach him. That matters, Evelyn. You were drowning in this apartment for 2 years, and I didn't notice. You were writing a diary about how invisible you felt, and I was in the next room, and I didn't see you. His voice broke on the last 2 words. It was the first crack in his composure, and it opened something in both of them. A release, a hemorrhage, the sudden overwhelming rush of everything they'd stored. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. She said it simply, without caveat, without excuse. For Derek, for the lies, for all of it. I'm sorry too, Grant said. For the silence, for the absence, for making you feel like furniture in your own home. They sat in the kitchen. The wine stood untouched. The journal lay between them. And for the first time in 2 years, they were in the same room, really in the same room, looking at each other with the terrible clarity of two people who had finally run out of places to hide. "I ended it," Evelyn said quietly. "2 weeks ago, before I knew you'd seen us." Grant looked at her. "Why?" "Because I looked at him one morning and realized I wasn't running toward him. I was running away from the silence. And Derek, he deserved better than being someone's escape route." She paused. "And so did I." Grant said nothing. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked. Outside, the Chicago wind pushed against the windows, and the apartment creaked in the way old buildings do. Settling, adjusting, accommodating the invisible shifts of pressure. "What do we do now?" Evelyn asked. Grant didn't answer, because the answer was sitting in his phone. Tim Nelson's number, the consultation appointment set for Friday, the word divorce already spoken aloud in a park while his daughter fed ducks. But he couldn't say it yet. Not here, not now, not across this table where they'd eaten 10,000 meals and helped Lily with homework and played cards on Friday nights and slowly, imperceptibly, stopped being married to each other. "I don't know," he said, and meant it. They sat on the couch at opposite ends, 3 cushions apart, close enough to touch if either of them reached, far enough to maintain the careful geometry of two people who have been honest for the first time in years and are not yet sure what honesty costs. It was the same night, after the kitchen, after the journal and the tears and the confession that had emptied them both of their most carefully guarded secrets. Evelyn had washed her face. Grant had poured 2 glasses of water and carried them to the living room without asking if she wanted to keep talking. She'd followed. They sat. And for the first few minutes they said nothing, the silence no longer evasive but exhausted, the quiet of a house after a storm, when the wind has stopped and the damage is visible and there's nothing to do but look at it. The living room was the room they'd lived in least. It had become, over the years, a transitional space, a hallway with a couch. They passed through it on their way to somewhere else. The kitchen, the bedroom, Lily's room, the office. The bookshelves held novels neither of them had touched in years. The framed photo on the mantel, Lily's first birthday, all 3 of them frosted with cake. Faced outward, performing family for anyone who entered. "When do you think it started?" Evelyn asked. She had her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, folded into herself like a question mark. The real breaking, not the affair. Before that. Grant considered this. He'd been turning the question over for weeks, excavating the timeline, searching for the fault line. "The night of your Byron reading," he said. 3 years ago. I forgot. You came home and I was asleep." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Earlier. It was before that. It was... Do you remember the week after your father died? You came home from the hospital and sat in this room for an hour, and I sat next to you and you didn't cry. You didn't say anything. I asked you what you needed, and you said, 'I'm fine.' And I knew you weren't, and I waited for you to let me in, and you never did." Grant stared at his hands. His father's death. 6 years ago. A heart attack in the foundation office, sudden and merciless. Grant had delivered the eulogy without his voice breaking. He'd been praised for his composure. So strong, people said. Walter would be proud. And he'd accepted the compliment and gone back to work the next day. Because work was the room where grief couldn't find him. "I thought I was being strong," he said. "You were," Evelyn said. "You were so strong you locked me out. And you never unlocked the door. I kept knocking for years, Grant. I knocked in every way I knew how. I planned dinners, I asked you questions, I wore that green blouse you liked. I left your coffee on the counter with notes. And you took the coffee and missed the notes and I stopped knocking because my hands were bruised." He absorbed this. Each sentence a stone added to a cairn he was building inside himself. A monument to the marriage he'd neglected. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say, "I was providing. I was working. I was building something for this family." But the words rang hollow even in his own mind, because the foundation was thriving and his marriage was rubble, and no amount of community impact metrics could compensate for a wife who wrote in her journal that she'd become furniture. "I used work the way you used Derek," Grant said. "As a place to go when being here was too hard." Evelyn flinched. The comparison was sharp, and he saw her instinct to reject it, to draw the line between emotional neglect and physical infidelity, to insist that they were not equivalent. But she didn't. She sat with it. She let the weight of it settle. Maybe, she said, but I'm the one who broke the vow. And I'm the one who emptied it of meaning first. The room held them. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car horn sounded, distant and irrelevant. What about Lily? Grant asked. The question he'd been circling for weeks, the question that sat at the center of everything like a stone in a river, forcing all the water to flow around it. She already knows something is wrong, Evelyn said. She asked me last week if we were going to get a different house. I think she heard the word divorce somewhere, school, maybe, or television, and she's been carrying it around, trying to figure out if it applies to us. Grant closed his eyes. 6 years old. Purple backpack. Iron-on stars and planets. The image of Lily in the Pinehurst pickup line, scanning the cars for a face that would tell her everything was okay, hit him with a force that made his chest physically ache. She deserves parents who are whole, Evelyn said, even if they're not together. Is that what you want? To not be together? Evelyn looked at him. Really looked. The way she used to, before the silence, before the distance, when looking at each other was a form of conversation. Her eyes were dark, exhausted, and in them Grant saw something he hadn't expected. Not certainty, not relief, but genuine, agonized indecision. I want to stop lying, she said. That's the only thing I know for sure. I want to stop lying to you, to Lily, to myself. Everything else, I don't know, Grant. I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if there's anything left to fix, or if we're just two people who loved each other once and stayed too long in the house where the love used to be. Grant leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor, the hardwood they'd chosen together, the rug Evelyn had found at a flea market in Andersonville, the small stain near the coffee table where Lily had spilled grape juice at 3 and Evelyn had laughed instead of scolding, and Grant had knelt with paper towels and thought, This is my life. This is enough. If I had been paying attention, he said, would you still have gone to him? The question filled the room. It was the question the entire story had been building toward. The question Grant had carried from the cafe window to the park bench to Brian's bourbon to Derek's espresso to this couch. This moment, this woman who was both the person he'd failed and the person who'd failed him. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence changed character, from hesitation to something deeper, a genuine reckoning with a question that had no safe answer. I don't know, she finally said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And that's the most honest thing I've ever said to you. Grant nodded. He didn't know if the answer was a mercy or a devastation. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps every true thing was. I called a lawyer, he said. Tim Nelson. I have an appointment on Friday. Evelyn's breath caught. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, a small, precise motion, and Grant saw in that nod the same composure he'd been praised for at his father's funeral, the stoicism that looked like strength and was actually the sound of a door closing. Okay, she said. They sat on the couch, 3 cushions apart. The distance between them had been measured in years, not feet, and they both knew, without saying, without needing to say, that this was the last night they would sit in this room as husband and wife. Tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, they would begin the slow, bureaucratic dismantling of the life they'd built, and the living room would become what it had always been. A place they passed through on their way to somewhere else. But tonight they stayed. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. They sat in the honest silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of two people who have said everything and are resting in the ruins of it. And the apartment settled around them like a body exhaling. At some point, Evelyn's hand moved across the middle cushion, not reaching for him, just resting there, palm up, in the space between. Grant looked at it. Her fingers, her wedding ring, the small scar on her thumb from a cooking accident on their first anniversary, when she'd been slicing onions and laughing at something he'd said, and the knife had slipped. He didn't take her hand, but he moved his own to the middle cushion, an inch from hers, and left it there. It was the closest they'd been in 2 years. 1 month later, Grant Foster sat alone at a table in a restaurant on Clark Street. The place was called Orso's, a small Italian trattoria with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles and a menu that hadn't changed in 15 years. It was the restaurant where he and Evelyn had held their Thursday dinners. Table 6, by the window, always at 6:15. The owner, a stout Sicilian named Marco who'd known them since the early years, had greeted Grant at the door with a handshake and a searching look. The look of a man who notices that one half of a regular couple has arrived without the other and knows better than to ask. "Just one tonight, Mr. Foster?" "Just one." Grant sat at table 6. He ordered a glass of the Chianti they always drank, the 2019 Reserva that Evelyn preferred because she said it tasted like autumn, and when the waiter brought it, he held the glass without drinking, watching the candlelight shift through the red. The apartment was gone. He'd moved out 2 weeks after the living room conversation, finding a modest one-bedroom near Crescent Park, close enough that Lily could walk to the pond when she stayed with him on weekends. The divorce papers had been filed, quietly, through Tim Nelson's office, and the process was proceeding with the civilized efficiency of two people who had decided to dismantle their marriage the way they should have maintained it. With attention, with care, with the deliberate effort they'd failed to give it when it mattered. Shared custody. Alternating weeks. Lily handled it with the resilience children summon when they have no choice. She'd cried the first night at Grant's apartment, standing in the unfamiliar bedroom with her purple backpack and her stuffed rabbit, asking why her nightlight was the wrong color. Grant had driven to 3 stores to find the right one. Blue, not white, the kind that turned the ceiling into water. And when he'd finally plugged it in and the room shifted to the familiar underwater glow, Lily had climbed into bed and said, "Daddy, this is okay." And Grant had sat in the hallway outside her door and pressed his fist to his mouth and grieved as silently as he could. He'd started therapy. Tuesdays at 4, a small office in Lakeview. A woman named Dr. Rains who had the unsettling habit of asking the questions he most wanted to avoid. She'd asked him, in their second session, what he was most afraid of, and he'd said, "That I'll do this again. That I'll find someone new and love her and stop seeing her. Because that's what I do. I disappear inside my work and I leave the person standing in the hallway in a dress I didn't notice." Dr. Rains had written something down. She'd said, "The fact that you can name it is the beginning of not repeating it." He wasn't sure he believed her, but he showed up every Tuesday, and he talked, and the talking carved out spaces inside him that had been sealed shut since his father's funeral. Rooms of grief and inadequacy and the particular shame of a man who'd been good at everything except the thing that mattered most. Evelyn had taken a sabbatical from the university. She was staying at their apartment, the apartment that was now hers, and she was, according to Rachel, writing again. Not the academic papers or the journal entries, but something else. A novel, maybe, or essays. Rachel didn't know the specifics, and Grant didn't ask. They communicated through text, through brief exchanges during Lily handoffs, through the careful, polite language of two people rebuilding a boundary that didn't exist before because they'd been standing so far apart they hadn't needed one. He thought about Derek Stone sometimes. Not with anger, the anger had never fully materialized, replaced instead by something more corrosive and less satisfying. Understanding. Derek had been a mirror in which Evelyn saw herself reflected as someone worth paying attention to, and Grant couldn't hate a man for doing what he himself had failed to do. He'd heard, through the small world machinery of Chicago's professional circles, that Derek had moved to Portland for a new project. He didn't know if Evelyn had spoken to him since. He didn't ask. The waiter refilled his water glass. The restaurant filled around him, couples, families, a group of women celebrating a birthday at the long table by the bar. The noise was warm and alive, and Grant sat inside it like a man sitting inside a memory, present but separate, watching the living world from the other side of a window. He thought about the cafe, about Café Lumiere, about the Tuesday afternoon that had cracked open his life and spilled its contents onto the sidewalk. He'd walked through the door. The bell had chimed. Evelyn had turned, and her face had emptied of color. Derek had looked up, confused, and Grant had stood at the edge of the table and spoken. He'd said, "I'm sorry. I should have been sitting there." That was all. 5 words. Not an accusation. Not a confrontation. An apology. Strange, quiet, incomprehensible to Derek Stone and devastating to Evelyn Brooks, who'd understood, in that single sentence, that her husband had seen everything and that his first instinct was not rage but regret. She'd understood that Grant was not saying "how dare you, but I know why," and that knowledge, that unbearable, compassionate knowledge, was worse than any fury could have been, because it left her nowhere to hide. Not behind indignation, not behind justification, not behind the narrative of the neglectful husband who'd driven her away. He'd taken that story from her by owning it first. I should have been sitting there. Grant lifted the Chianti and took his first sip. Tasted like autumn, like Evelyn had always said. He set the glass down and looked at his watch. The time they used to meet, every Thursday, for years. The time that had once been sacred, not because of the restaurant or the wine or the food, but because it was the hour they'd agreed to stop everything else and be in the same room on purpose. And then they'd stopped agreeing, and the hour had become just an hour, and the room had become just a room, and the two people who used to sit at this table had become strangers who shared a daughter and a lease and a silence so vast it had swallowed everything. Grant reached for his left hand. The wedding ring was still there. He'd worn it through the separation, through the lawyer meetings, through the nights alone in his new apartment when the quiet pressed against him like a living thing. He'd kept it on because removing it felt like an ending, and he'd been postponing endings for years. But the ring was not a marriage. It was gold. It was metal. It was a circle with no beginning and no end, and it had sat on his finger so long he'd forgotten it was there, and that was the metaphor he could no longer ignore. He slid the ring off slowly. It resisted. 7 years of wear had shaped it to his finger, and then it released, and his hand felt strange. Lighter. Exposed. Like a wall with a painting removed, the outline still visible, the absence more present than the thing itself. He held the ring in his palm, studied it under the candlelight. Such a small object to carry so much weight. He placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest, where he could feel its slight pressure like a second heartbeat. Not discarded, not forgotten, just moved from where it had been to where it belonged now, close but no longer binding. Grant left cash on the table. He stood. He buttoned his coat. He nodded to Marco, who nodded back with the solemn courtesy of a man who understood that some goodbyes don't need words. He pushed open the door and stepped into the Chicago evening. The air was sharp with the first real cold of December, carrying the clean, metallic scent of coming snow. The streetlights threw long halos on the wet pavement, and the city moved around him. Cabs, pedestrians, the distant rumble of the L train. All of it continuing, indifferent, alive. He did not look back at table 6. He did not look at the window where the candle was still burning, where the Chianti glass sat half empty, where the ghost of a woman who used to laugh across from him would linger until Marco cleared the table and set it for someone new. It was 6:15, the time they used to meet every Thursday for dinner, back when showing up still meant something. Grant Foster looked at the empty street ahead of him, felt the ring against his chest, and walked into the Chicago evening without looking back. Not because he was finished grieving, but because he'd finally learned the difference between holding on and being present, and he understood now that he'd spent years doing one while failing at the other. The snow began to fall, light, tentative, the first flakes of winter dissolving on the warm pavement before they could accumulate. Grant walked through them, and they touched his face like small, cold questions, and he didn't brush them away. He kept walking,